Salut! Hi guys, this is Weasel. Welcome to the second video in the Beating the Micros series. Hopefully you've had a chance to check out the second article. It talks about how to configure your HUD, the different stats you might consider using, and how we can begin to profile player types by their stats. As we play today, hopefully we can think about the different types of players at our table and how best we can exploit them. We'll be playing 4 tables of 10 and L, this time on Party Poker, and hopefully as we go through the series we can mix it up, play on a variety of different sites, and see what kind of games we can expect depending on where we play. So far we don't have too many reads, however there are certain things you can look for without having any stats on the players. One of the main things is stack sizes. If we see someone sitting with a stack below 100 big blinds, it's quite possible they are a weaker player. For example, on table 3, the player in the top left is sitting with less than 100 big blinds. Also, over 55 hands, he has been playing 61-18. It is quite likely this player is a fish, or a weaker player. There are also players with much shorter stacks than this. For example, on table 2, the player on the right is sitting with less than 30 big blinds. These type of players may be short stackers and differ somewhat from fish in that they are playing a specific strategy depending on their stack size. So we definitely need to watch out for these type of players. There is another possible short stacker on table 1 in the bottom right. We do, however, need to be careful about jumping to conclusions about how we think a player is going to play based on their stats if we don't have a good sample size. The stats we collect are only as useful as the sample we have. To the action, table 3. Under the gun open raises and we call in the cutoff with pocket 6s, which is pretty standard. Under the gun has been playing 19-16 over 77 hands. It's quite likely he is a regular. On a King-King 5 board, we can expect him to fire a c-bet reasonably often with most of his range for opening pre-flop. This can include some hands we beat, such as Ace-Jack, Ace-Queen. It can also include some higher pocket pairs than ours, pocket 10s, pocket jacks, perhaps even some worse pocket pairs. I do think against his flop bet we do have a profitable call. Some of the time we will have the best hand, and the times he has a hand like pocket 9s or pocket 10s, we may be able to fold him off this hand on certain turns and rivers. However, he does fire a second barrel, and our plan is to fold. It's unlikely he fires a second barrel with some of his overcard type hands, for example Ace-Jack or Ace-Queen. He also may not fire a second barrel with some of his pocket 10 type hands. It is, however, a possibility. We don't have too much information on his turn barreling frequency as of yet, so we decide to make a fold on the turn. Table 1. We have the 5-4 suited. We shouldn't typically be playing suited connectors out of position, they don't play so well. The only time you can make an exception to this rule is if you think you have good implied odds. And there are 2 factors in deciding the implied odds you have, and that is if the open raiser is playing especially tight, you have increased implied odds, and if the open raiser has an especially deep stack, you have good implied odds. In this case, the open raiser is 100 big blinds deep, but we don't necessarily know if he's opening that tight and whether he's likely to be stacking off post-flop if we do hit a strong hand. Table 4, the button open raises and we call in the big blind with Ace-Jack. I see no reason to 3-bet for value. So far the button has been playing quite tight. The flop comes 8-5-2, We could consider floating here. Given that the button has been playing tight so far, it's fine to check fold. Table 3, we open raise the pocket sixes from under the gun and the cut of 3 bets. Typically in this spot, when someone 3 bets versus an under the gun raise, it represents quite an amount of strength. The reason being, our under the gun open raise should be a lot tighter than our raises from other positions. Therefore, when someone 3 bets that tighter range, we can expect them to have a strong hand most of the time. We shouldn't really be set mining in a 3 bet pot 100 big blinds deep. In this situation, we have a fairly easy fold. Table 4, we have 10 jack offsuit in the big blinds. We open raise. We only raise to 2x. I think normally my standard is 2.5x in the small blind. I don't think Party Poker has a 2.5x button, so it's possible this is me being lazy. However, I do think open min raising in the small blind is fine. It mainly depends on the calling frequency of the big blind, and I don't necessarily think the big blind in many cases is changing his calling frequency depending on whether I open to 2x or I open to 4x. Personally, if I'm in the big blind and the small blind is open raising, I am defending with a very wide range. The reason being, I'm getting great immediate odds to call. I'm also going to be playing that pot in position, meaning I can take the pot down post flop more often. If you are open min raising from the small blind, you will eventually run into regulars who understand that they should be calling wider to a min raise. When you do run into these players, you can make one of 2 adjustments. You can either begin tightening your small blind open raising range, or you can begin opening to 4x. Table 2, we have a suited ace on the button, which is a standard hand to consider a steal. Thanks a lot to Unknown for posting some questions in the thread. Feel free to post if you have any questions you'd like answering. The first part of the question was, how do you determine what equity you have while playing? In order to establish the equity you have, you first need to be able to put your opponent on a range, and we will be discussing this in the upcoming article on hand reading. Once you have a good idea of your opponent's range, you can then begin to estimate your equity against this range. And it's something that comes with practice. For example, a lot of you may know that the equity of a flush draw against top pair, top kicker is around 30%. However, would you feel comfortable estimating the equity of top pair against a flush draw, some sets, some overpairs, and some second pairs? It's perhaps a more realistic situation to be calculating equity against a compound range rather than a specific type of hand. And it's something that you will improve at as you gradually see many different types of situations and get used to estimating your equity against certain ranges. The second part of the question was, how do you proceed on various flops with no equity? The short answer is, if you have no equity, you just fold the hand. When we play poker, the profitability of a hand depends on 2 factors, the steal equity and the pot equity you have, and it's a combination of these 2 that make the hand profitable. Table 2, we open raise the 10-8 offsuit from the button, making a standard steal attempt, and the small blind 3 bets. So far, the small blind has been playing 21-21 over 26 hands. When someone's VPIP is the same as their PFR, it means they are not cold calling any hands. Any hand they do play, they are coming in for a raise. When someone's VPIP is the same as their PFR, it therefore indicates they are typically quite an aggressive opponent. We do fold the 10-8 offsuit on the button to the 3-bet, but we do take a note that this player 3-bet versus our button opening range. It is possible he's 3-betting light. We will keep an eye out for him. Table 4, with the King-Jack suited. We make a standard open raise from the small blind. The flop comes 10-9-8 rainbow, reasonably drawy flop. It's also important to notice that the big blind is short stacked. He has less than 30 big blinds remaining in his stack. I decide to fire a c-bet on this flop for several reasons. The first being we do have some equity. We have an open ender on the flop. The second reason is while the big blind may have connected with this flop on occasion, I think if he does have a hand that has missed this flop, he will be folding it a high percentage of the time. This board does look reasonably scary. And the third reason is, given the fact he is short stacked, it is going to be much easier for us to put him to a commitment decision and put him in a situation where he's likely to fold his marginal hands or decide to commit with them. So against certain part of his ranges, we have more fold equity than we might have versus a deeper stack. The turn comes a 5, which is more or less a blank. However, I don't think he's necessarily folding a lot of his range with which he calls the flop. And seeing as I have king high at this moment in time, I decide it's best to check and hope to see a free river. I do hit on the river, and since we make out straight, we definitely want to think about value betting to get called by any 6 or perhaps any 2 pair. And he folds. As I was saying, when we play any hand in poker, its profitability depends on a mixture of its pot equity and its fold equity. On occasions, you may have very low pot equity, but if you have sufficient steal equity, then you can continue with the hand, and your steal equity will obviously depend on a number of factors, such as the flop texture, the villain you're playing against. In general, if you have no fold equity and no steal equity, you should typically not be continuing with a hand, so the answer is you just fold if you have no pot equity and no steal equity. Table 2 with the ace-9 offsuit. MP open raises. We are out of position with a marginal hand, and it's important to notice also that MP is short stacked. We have a pretty easy fold with the ace-9 offsuit. Table 3, we get dealt pocket jacks. Under the gun open raises, and we call in the cutoff. Under the gun is the same regular we played a hand against before, where he fired 2 streets on a king-king-x board. So far then, he has shown a tendency to fire a second barrel. Again, we expect him to be c-betting most of his under the gun opening range on an 8-9-2 board. His range can include overcards, it can include some pocket pairs, some of which beat us, some of which we beat. It can also include some flush draws, and perhaps a hand like 10-jack for the straight draw if he's opening 10-jack suited from under the gun. Against this range, we definitely have a profitable flop call. The turn comes 8 of diamonds. It doesn't change a lot unless he does have any 8x hands in his opening range, which is less likely. It's possible he may not be firing the turn again, however, with some of his overcard type hands. It's also possible he does, since so far he has shown a tendency to fire a second barrel. He can definitely be barreling his flush draws, his straight draws, some of his better pocket pairs, like queens plus, a worse pocket pair, like pocket tens, and perhaps even a hand like pocket sevens if he thinks the 8 is a blank, and we are unlikely to have a hand. Perhaps he thinks we're drawing, and also some of his 9x hands, if he has these in his range. We therefore decide to call the turn and to evaluate on the river. The river comes the ace of spades, which is a bad card for us. If he was barreling his flush draws, he is now hit on the river. If he was barreling an overcard type hand like ace king or ace queen, he is now hit on the river. Our plan is to fold to a sizable river bet. However, he bets $1.90, which is less than a third pot. What kind of hands can we expect him to be doing this with? If he was barreling a flush on the turn and he hits on the river, I definitely think he is betting at least 2/3 pot on this river. It's also possible he may even be shoving, given that I have only one pot size bet left on the river. This looks to me like a type of blocker bet. What does his range look like for making a block bet? I definitely think he could play some of his ace-x hands this way. If he was barreling a hand like ace-king and he hits on the river, he is obviously aware that he does not have the nuts and doesn't want to get raised on this river, and so could make a block bet, hoping to sometimes get called by worse and sometimes prevent me from raising with a better hand. He could also be block betting with a 9x type hand, a hand like pocket tens, which we beat. He could also be block betting with a hand like pocket queens and pocket kings. Against this range, I think the best play is to shove as a bluff. His block bet range is pretty much capped at ace-x hands, if our read is correct, and it is possible he will be folding an ace-x hand to a river shove. Perhaps not all of the time, but some of the weaker hands, such as king-king and queen-queen, I definitely expect him to fold to a river shove a reasonable amount of the time. As I was recording the session though, I did decide to flat. The reason being, we are getting a great price on a call. We literally need to only be correct 20% of the time for this to be an okay play in the long run, and I think he has a hand like 9x or pocket tens that he's block betting with for this to be an okay play. He does end up having the pocket jacks, and we chop the pot. Table 1. Cut off open raises, we call on the button with pocket fives, and we flop a set on a monotone board. There are two types of strategies you can use in this particular situation. There is a high variance option and there is a low variance option, both of which are fine. The high variance option is to raise immediately for value. It's likely you have the best hand, and you should try and get the money in as fast as possible. There is, however, an alternative, which is the low variance option, and this is good if you want to limit the variance in your game. And this strategy involves doing everything we can to see a cheap turn card. If we like the turn card, we then try and get the money in on the turn. The advantage to playing this way is if the turn does come a spade, you can then fold without having invested too much money into the hand. And you can potentially also draw to your full house outs if you think you are getting the right price. When a turn comes a blank, villain's equity is literally halved. So if you can get the money in on the turn rather than the flop, you are getting your money in a much higher EV situation. In general, it's possible that the EV of raising the flop is slightly higher than the EV of flatting and hoping to see a turn card, but the second option is definitely lower variance. The turn card comes as 7 of spades, which is not a good card. Our plan is to fold to a large bet, but given the price we're getting, and given the fact that we should have reasonable implied odds if we do hit our full house, we can definitely make the call on the turn here and hope to hit. The river's a 7, so we do make our boat. When the cutoff checks to us, our only option is to put in a value bet and hope to get called by any of his flushes. We make it reasonably big, since we are hoping he can't fold a hand like ace of spades or king of spades, even on a paired board. And he folds. Table 3, we have the ace-queen suited in the small blind. The hijack open raises to 4x. You could definitely consider folding in this situation. In fact, if I had ace-queen offsuit, I would probably fold. The reason being, we are out of position. So far the hijack's been playing very tightly. Out of position and not doing too well against his range, it's definitely fine to fold. I do make the call in this case, mainly because my hand is suited. The flop comes ace king 10, and obviously we do flop top pair. The flop, however, is not great for us, given that it is so drawy. I definitely don't want to be giving any free cards on this flop. So I decide to bet. However, if I am raised, I can't really do much, as there are plenty of hands that beat me, so my plan on the flop is to bet fold. When this player raises, it's quite possible I am beat, and so I fold. Attempting to check call will make the hand very difficult to play, and of course we don't want to give free cards. So while it's not a great situation, I think bet folding is your best option. Table 3, we open raise the pocket nines from the button. The small blind calls, you short stacked. The flop comes Jack 10-6 monotone, which is a bad board for us. There are 2 overcards, and there are possible flushes and flush draws, which we have no piece of. We just decide to fold the flop. Unknown second question. What kind of flops are there, and how do you recognize them? And how do you play accordingly on them? Well, the short answer is there are many different types of flops. We will look into different types of flop textures in a little more detail in the article on c-betting and barreling. There are dry boards, high dry boards, low dry boards, high drawy boards, low drawy boards. And how you play on these different types of boards really depends on a few things. For example, villain, your specific hand. As we discussed in the previous video, some flops are considered optimal for a c-bet, such as dry boards, but against certain types of players, such as regulars, they may be less optimal for a c-bet, simply because that regular expects you to be firing a c-bet on a dry board. Table 2, we have 9-6 suited on the button, a fine hand to make a button steal attempt. And the small blind 3 bets. This is the player that 3 bet us before in exactly the same situation. We open raised the button with the 10-8 offsuit, and this player put in a 3 bet. This was the player I said had not been cold calling any hands. Any hand he is playing aggressively. Small blind versus button is a typical spot where you expect people to be 3 betting light a reasonable amount of the time. I do think it's likely this player is 3 betting light, so this is a good spot to make a 4 bet bluff. As for your 4 bet sizing, it should be somewhere between 2.3x and 2.8x. Anywhere around here is fine for 4 bet sizing. As a rough guide, your 4 bet should be around 25% of effective stack sizes. In the case of a $10 stack, this means anything around $2.50 as a 4 bet size should be fine. We make it 270 with our 9-6 suited. And I think it's likely he is either 5 bet shoving or he is folding. If he does flat, however, we do have a hand with some potential. It can make some flushes and some straights. Even if he does decide to 5-bet shove, this isn't too much of a disaster. The reason being, it's possible he's 3-betting light, and it's a good idea to let people know early on in the session that you are not going to be allowing them to push you around. Even if you end up 4-bet folding in this spot, it shows you are not going to idly fold away every time he 3-bets, and he may tighten up his 3-bet frequencies from now on. Table 2, we pick up the ace-10 off suit in the cutoff. This is a standard open raise from the cutoff on most tables. And the small blind calls, who so far has been playing 24-21 over 38 hands. He is full stacked. It's reasonably likely this player is a regular. The flop comes 10-9-6 with a flush draw and plenty of straight draws. We definitely want to be betting for value on this flop. We don't want to give a free card to any of his drawing hands. So our plan is to bet the flop for value, hope to get called by worse 10x's, any flush draw, any pair plus straight draw, and some of the combo draws, for example a hand like 9-8 of diamonds. Our plan is to fire the flop, and definitely also fire any safe turn cards for value. The turn comes at 10, which is good. It's now less likely he's going to be folding any of his worst 10x hands. We definitely want to be firing the turn again and make sure we charge any of his drawing hands. And he folds. Unknown's third question. When and how do you decide to check call, check raise, or check fold your hand? It's really a combination of a few of the things we've looked at so far. If you take it down to the most basic level, it's really a 3-step process. The first step is putting your opponent on a range, and we'll be considering that a little bit in the article on hand reading. Once you've put your opponent on a range, you then need to estimate your equity against that range. And as discussed, sometimes that range will be a compound range rather than a specific type of hand. And the third step is you then decide how to maximize your equity against that range, depending on which line you decide to take. And which line you decide to take is really dependent on how you think villain responds to various plays with various parts of his range. Poker is obviously a game of information, and in order to make the best decisions, reads are very helpful. So to summarize, it's a 3-step process. Put your opponent on a range, calculate your equity, and then decide how you can maximize your value against that range. Which line do you want to take? Table 4. The cutoff open raises. The cutoff has been playing 13-11 over 147 hands. We can definitely put him in either the tight regular category or the nit category. So far, his c-bet has been 29%, which means he's not firing the flop with a lot of his open raising range. It seems if he misses the flop, he is not firing. I definitely think on a king 10-5 board, he is firing some of his king x hands, possibly some of his 10x hands, perhaps a draw like jack queen. When it gets checked to us with the pocket sevens, we want to put in a vet for value stroke protection. There's no need to give a free card to hands like ace jack or ace queen. Sometimes they may call with these hands. Given the fact that there are 2 overpairs on the board, we are happy just to take the pot down. We mainly bet to protect our equity. Table 2. The hijack open min raises, the cutoff calls. Suited connectors typically play well under one of two conditions, preferably either the pot is multi-way or you are in position. In this case we have both. We should definitely be playing a hand like King 10 suited. The hijack does fire a c-bet, a very small c-bet. He min-bets. It's quite likely we can deduce from this that the hijack is a weaker player. It's possible also the cutoff is a weaker player. On this flop, the ace queen 9, we do have a gut shot. We could consider raising. I'm not, however, convinced we have enough fold equity to make it profitable. It's possible one of these two players is calling with any pair, any type of gut shot. For example, a hand like King Jack, which beats us. We are also getting an excellent price to draw to our gut shot. We make the call on the flop. On the turn, the hijack checks, and now the cutoff fires a fifth pot. Again, similar situation exists on the turn. I'm not convinced we have too much fold equity. You could definitely consider a raise here if you think either of these players is going to be folding a gut shot or a straight draw type hand, or perhaps even any pair. We are also getting an excellent price to call, especially now we turn the 6 of diamonds for a flush draw also. We decide to make the call. We do hit on the river, and now it's just a case of going for value and hope that they can call with any of their pair hands. Table 4, we open raise the pocket jacks from the hijack, button calls, and we flop second set. Our plan on this board should be to fire 3 streets for value and hope we get called by a type of King X or some draws. When the turn comes a 2 of diamonds, it's pretty much a blank, and we should definitely stick to our plan of firing the turn for value. And hope he can continue with any King X, a hand like 10 Queen. Table 3 with the 5-6 suited. We are in position. We could continue with this hand. We could decide to call. We may have reasonable implied odds against the under the gun opening raise. The main problem with calling in a spot like this is there are 4 people to act behind, any of which could raise. If they do raise, we are going to have to fold our hand. Table 1, we do end up raising the 9-jack offsuit. This was actually a misclick. I assumed I was stealing from the blinds. Under the gun did actually open limp, however. I did not see this. Under the gun has been playing 55-0 so far, after 11 hands. Anytime someone open limps, much of the time you can mark them as either a weak irregular or a fish. Either way, isolating with a hand like Jack 9 offsuit versus an under the gun limp is probably fine. It's not a play I would normally make as standard. My intention was to steal the blinds and did not see the pot had already been opened. Either way, our hand should play fine. The small blind comes along and we do flop an open ender. We could decide to fire this flop. I'm not convinced we have enough fold equity to make it profitable. I expect under the gun to be calling with any hand that's hit the flop, any flush draw, any straight draw, any pair. We decide to check back the flop and hope to improve on the turn. We do improve on the turn. The 8 of clubs obviously puts a flush draw out there also. We don't have the nuts. And again we find ourselves in another situation where we can take one of two strategies. We can choose to raise immediately for value, which is the higher variance option, or we can choose to flat. The advantages to raising are perhaps we charge any of his one card flush draws. Maybe we can get value from a hand like Queen 10 or a set. The downside is, if he decides to 3-bet shove over our raise on the flop, we are in a difficult situation. The reason being, we don't know if he is capable of shoving a hand like Queen 10 or a set, which we beat. If he is only shoving flushes to our turn raise, we are pretty much drawing dead and definitely don't want to get our stack in. There is also the danger that making a raise on the flop, we can definitely fold out some of the hands that we beat rather than extract value from them. He may even fold a hand like Queen 10. He may fold a hand like Queen X. This way there is a chance he continues to fire some of his worst made hands on the river. So you can raise. Flatting is also fine. Flatting is also lower variance, and it does make the hand easier to play. The river comes a 10, it pairs the board, not a great card. Any Queen 10 now has a full house, any set now has a full house. On the river we find ourselves in a similar situation to that on the turn. We could definitely consider a raise for value, but we don't necessarily have the best hand, and it is possible he will fold all worse hands to a raise on this river and only continue with flushes or full houses. Given his bet sizing, I think it's unlikely he has a full house. I think it's also less likely he has a flush. In retrospect, I do think perhaps making a small value raise on the river is your best option. I also think flatting is fine and lower variance. There's no right or wrong answer. What you decide to do on this turn and river is really down to your preference and your play style and the amount of variance you personally are willing to accept. He does end up showing down Queen King, not to be results orientated against that specific part of his range. If we had raised the turn, he may have folded, and he also may have folded on the river if we'd raised the river. Against that specific hand, we may have actually maximized our value by playing the way we did. Of course, we shouldn't be thinking about specific hands, however, and only how to maximize your value against someone's entire range. Table 4, we have the Queen King offsuit in the small blinds. Under the gun limps. Under the gun's playing 37-17, quite possibly a weaker player, especially given that he opened limps. Player in the hijack, who's been playing reasonably tight, 18-13 over 39 hands, makes an isolation raise. When you see this situation, a regular making an isolation raise versus a possible fish, you can definitely assume the regular is some of the time lighter than normal. They just want to play a pot in position against a fish. However, a hand like Queen King offsuit out of position against a reasonably tight player, it's fine to fold pre-flop. Table 3, the King 9 offsuit under the gun. We are just going to go ahead and fold. Table 4, we have 9-8 offsuit on the button. We are definitely going to make a steal attempt if this gets folded round to us. It's quite possible the big blind is a fish. Our hand does have some potential, however. The big blind makes the call, and we do flop top pair. There aren't perhaps too many made hands we can get value from. Perhaps a hand like pocket 6s or pocket 5s. Maybe some 3x and 4x hands if they are in his range. However, so far the big blind has a low fold to c-bet, we can definitely expect him to be floating certain overcard type hands. If we fire a c-bet here, we should definitely therefore bet our hand for value and hope he floats us in an attempt to spike an overcard on the turn. The turn comes a 3, which is a reasonably safe card. It only improves a very small part of his range, specifically the part of his range that has 3x hands, which is a narrow part of his range. We definitely should continue firing on the turn for the same reasons we fired the flop. We definitely don't want to give a free river card to any overcards. We want to continue extracting value from any pocket 6s, 7s, 5s, or any 4x. We definitely fire the turn for value. The river comes a 6, which is a reasonable safe card. It does complete some hands. If he had a hand like pocket 6s, he now has us beat. We do expect to have the best hand reasonably often here, however. This doesn't necessarily mean we should fire a value bet. A lot of the range that can call us on the turn include some overcard type hands, which are not going to be calling a third barrel on the river. In fact, it's difficult for him to call a third barrel on the river with any hand that is weaker than an 8x hand that beats ours, a better 8. While we do expect to have the best hand reasonably often, I don't think we are necessarily getting called by a lot of the hands that we beat. For example, any random overcards. We should definitely just check back the river. And he does end up having ace-king offsuit. I don't think he's calling with ace-king if we fire a third barrel on the river, but he's definitely calling with some of his hands that spike trips on the turn, or a hand like pocket 6s. Our best option is to check back. Table 1. The button, who is half stacked and playing 28-17 over 49 hands, makes a 2.5x raise from the button. Given the price we are getting from the big blind, we can definitely call with a hand like ace-9 suited. If we look at his stats, he does, however, have 100% fold to 3-bet so far. Therefore, we could also definitely consider turning our ace-9 suited into a bluff pre-flop. We do flop bottom pair. The board is not good for us. There are 2 overcards, plenty of straight and flush draws. Our best option is to check fold on the flop. Table 1 with the queen 8, we decide to fold. The big blind has been 3-betting reasonably often. He does look like he might be an okay regular. There's no need to attempt to steal marginal hands out of position against these type of players. Table 1, under the gun, open raises, and yes, he is a fish, but we're definitely folding the ace-5 offsuit, especially when the hijack min 3-bets. And so far his 3-bet stat is 1.8%. So on table 1 we can definitely expect the hijack to have a strong hand, given that he's rarely 3-betting and he decides to min 3-bet against an under the gun open raise. It's likely he has a strong hand. Table 1, we're definitely raising the 10-8 suited from the cutoff. We know the player in the big blind is a fish. He calls. We do flop a gutter. And so far this player has been folding to c-bets. We do fire a c-bet on this board. And he raises. And I decide to fold. Not getting a great price on the call. It's also important to take notice of the fact that we are not drawing to the nuts. If we do hit our gut shot, there is a higher straight on board. In general, you shouldn't be drawing with hands unless you're drawing to preferably the nuts. It's always going to be less optimal to draw to straights and flushes and things on paired boards, and in the same manner it's not going to be as profitable to draw to second nut straights, because some of the time when you do make your hand, you're going to find yourself being stacked by a better straight. So it's not just the odds of making your hand that are important. You need to think about some of the reverse implied odds you have. For example, when you even do make your hand, you can sometimes still lose. You definitely need to take into consideration things like reverse implied odds. Table 3. We are dealt King Jack offsuit. Our hijack open raises. This is the regular we played a couple of hands against. He has been playing aggressively so far. He's been firing c-bets and second barrels. We don't want to defend a hand like King Jack offsuit even in position. It's likely we are going to be folding too often post-flop when he fires barrels, when we make weak top pairs with that King Jack hand. We definitely want to fold pre-flop. I think I'm going to skip the video forward now to find some good hands, since if I remember, I'm pretty much card dead for a while. Okay, we pick up Queen 9 suited in the button on table 3. We've just got to this table. We don't know anything about either of the blinds. Without any further information, we are going to raise. The flop comes good for us. We have the second nut flush draw, and also the board is semi-dry ace high, so we can expect to have a reasonable amount of fold equity. Given our pot equity and fold equity combined, we definitely want to be firing a c-bet on this board. We bet around 2/3 pot, and the big blind makes a small check raise, slightly over a min raise. Given the price we are getting here, we need to have 25% equity or thereabouts to make the call. A lot of the time we will have 30% equity. We also have good implied odds if we hit. Hopefully the big blind will pay us off with his ace-x type hands and some of his sets if we do hit our hand on later streets. The turn gives us our flush. And the big blind continues firing on the turn. I think the best option here is to flat. It keeps our range slightly wider. We don't want to risk the big blind folding some of his ace-x type hands. If he has ace-king or ace-queen, we do want him to think he has the best hand and continue firing. Our decision then is to flat the turn and to raise the river if he bets. In order not to give away the strength of our hand, we can make use of timing tails. There's no need to call too quickly. We can tank for a while, make it look like we have a difficult decision, which we don't. And the same goes for the river. When he bets a river, we tank for a while, and then we shove. Giving away deceptive timing tails is free. Against some players it may make no difference, but against other players, sometimes it may cause them to believe our range is wider than it is. And we end up stacking top pair, top kicker. Table 4, we open the pocket sevens and the cutoff, take it down. Table 4 with the 7-6 suited, we can definitely consider an open raise with this hand from the hijack. Folding would also be acceptable depending on the players behind. Table 1, the cutoff open raises to 2.5x, and we decide to put in a 3-bet for value. Flatting with our queens there is definitely an option, the reason being the player in the cutoff has been folding a lot to 3-bets, and ideally we would like some action with our pocket queens. Also, there is the fact that on table 1 we have been playing very tightly, just due to the fact that we have been card dead on this table. So when we do finally put in a 3-bet, it looks a lot stronger than it might normally, than if we'd been active. You definitely need to think about your own table image when deciding which play you want to make. We 3-bet the queens and he folds. Table 4, under the gun, open limps. He's been playing 29-6 over 51 hands. It's likely he is a fish. He is also 30 big blinds deep only. In this particular situation, I see no reason to raise the pocket sixes here, for 3 reasons. 1, we are out of position. 2, our equity is never going to be that large against his open limping range. Even if he only has 2 ragged over cards, we are still in a coin flip situation. And the 3rd reason, he is short stacked. We don't want to bloat the pot unnecessarily with our small pocket pair. If we do hit our set after we check back, there's still a good chance we can get the money in versus a short stacker. We decide to check back in the big blind. Table 1, we pick up the ace-king offsuit in the small blind. And the button open raises to 2.5x. This is the same player we 3-bet queens against a few hands ago. And we did notice he had a high fold to 3-bet. Also, our table image on this particular table is tight. We are basically going to get a lot of respect if we 3-bet this player. Given how the queen-queen hand worked out, we decide to flat our ace-king. It's also true that the button has a 53% attempt to steal so far. His button range here is definitely very wide. And we do ideally want to play a hand like ace-king, so we flat to play against his button opening range. However, the big blind does put in a 3-bet. The button folds. And in this situation, you have 2 options. You can either choose to 4-bet with the intention of calling a shove, or you can choose to flat his 3-bet. And both options have different advantages and disadvantages. The advantage to 4-betting is you don't have to play a pot out of position. You can still occasionally get value from worse hands. The downside is it's possible for the big blind to be bluffing in this spot. By 4-betting, we cause him to fold the range with which he's bluffing and only continue with the hands with which he's betting for value. As for calling, the downside to calling is we have to play a pot out of position. Also, while ace-king is likely ahead of his range, the equity of ace-king, even against any 2 cards, is not that high. If we do miss the flop, it's going to be difficult for us to get to showdown with our ace-king out of position. However, the advantage is to flatting. If he is bluffing, we can keep in the bluff part of his range by flatting. In the spot you can do either. I choose to flat. Ironically, in this situation, 4-betting may perhaps even be lower variance, just for the fact that the big blind is folding very often to our 4-bet, but we don't necessarily want folds with a hand like ace-king. We flop pretty well. We flop top pair, top kicker. The way we've played it, we're hoping to keep some bluffs in his range or some weaker hands, it doesn't ever make sense to check raise the flop. We decide to check call. The turn comes the two of diamonds. Your standard play in this spot should be to check call the turn again. I hope he continues with some of his worst ace-x hands. Perhaps he fires a second barrel on some of his bluffs. There is another option that you can take, which I do occasionally, and that is to donk the turn. The reason we might choose to donk the turn is it confuses people. It literally doesn't make sense for us to donk the hand with any hand we can possibly have. Occasionally when we donk the turn here, it's possible the big blind will put us on some type of semi-bluff hand, such as Queen King or 10 King, a hand that we don't want to check call with, our gut shot, but we don't mind semi-bluffing with fold equity. This can cause the big blind to play back at us wider than he might normally. For example, he may make a bluff raise against our turn donk. He may also flat with hands that he wouldn't normally fire a second barrel on the turn with. For example, if we check to him on the turn, he may be checking back a hand like pocket kings, pocket queens, some of his jack X hands. He might be checking back some of his weaker aces, such as his suited ace X hands or perhaps an ace 10 hand. Whereas these hands facing a turn donk bet may be confused into calling a street where they normally wouldn't have fired a second barrel. So we choose to donk the turn. And this line also works well in single raised pots. It works in 3-bet pots, but you can definitely do it in single raised pots. If, for example, the button open raises and you call in the blinds and you hit top pair, top kicker, you can choose to check call the flop and donk the turn. One advantage is, of course, you don't allow the player in position to take a free card if he is c-betting the flop light, and some players do c-bet a very high frequency and then don't follow up with second barrels on the turn. This way you don't allow your opponent to see a free card in position with your top pair, top kicker hands. And in general the line is confusing as it doesn't make a lot of sense with any hand. It works better if the turn card is a dry card or a blank. Table 1, we have the 7-6 suited on the button. It's a multi-way pot, we are in position, we definitely want to be playing this hand. The flop comes 9-6-4 and we flop second pair. It gets checked to us, and when this happens we want to fire on the flop. The reason being, 1, a hand is quite possibly the best hand. It's possible any of these 3 players may have bet the flop with a hand that beats ours. And we definitely want to protect our equity against random overcards. The second reason we want to fire on the flop is we have a ton of backdoors on this flop, which will give us opportunity to fire a second barrel. Any 6, any 7, any 8, any 5, any diamond are all good barreling cards. We could also consider barreling some types of overcards, for example an ace on the turn or a king, queen or jack on the turn. So if either of these 3 players do have a weaker made hand which they want to check call the flop with, for example a better 6x, a 9x, some types of pocket pairs, or perhaps even overcards, we have a good shot at barreling them off this hand on the turn. Therefore our plan is to bet the flop and to fire a decent amount of turn barrels, depending on who calls. And we take it down on the flop. Table 3, we have the pocket queens in the hijack, under the gun open raises. Typically, as a general rule in micro-stakes games, you shouldn't be 3-betting against an under the gun raise unless one of 2 things is true. Either the under the gun player needs to be a huge fish, capable of continuing with a very wide range to your 3-bet. Either this, or you have pocket kings plus. The reason being, as discussed previously, when you 3-bet versus an under the gun raiser, it looks very strong. And therefore, the range that they are going to be continuing with against that 3-bet versus the undergun range is a range that a hand like pocket queens, or even a hand like ace king, perhaps doesn't do so well against. And the rest of the time, because of the amount of fold equity you have, you are going to be pretty much throwing your pocket queens in the muck as the undergun player folds many of his hands that he's open raising from under the gun with. The flop comes King Jack 6. It's not the world's greatest flop. However, the original open raiser does not c-bet, which suggests he doesn't have a hand that's connected with the flop in a strong way. He probably doesn't have a King X type hand, probably doesn't have a flush draw. We should definitely try and take the initiative in this pot and see if we can take it down. It's quite possible our hand is good, and we don't want to give any free cards on such a board. Table 1 with the ace-10 offsuit. The small blind completes, and we make a standard raise, hoping to either take it down pre-flop or play a pot in position with a reasonable hand. The flop comes 6-3-2, and the small blind donks. It's not a good flop for us. Some of our outs, ace of hearts, 10 of hearts, are tainted. We can definitely just fold in this situation. Table 1, we pick up the ace-jack offsuit. Table 3, we open raise. Table 4, we open raise the ace-queen offsuit under the gun. Table 3, under the gun open raises. As discussed, we shouldn't be 3-betting versus an under the gun open raiser. However, when the hijack calls and he's playing 56-13, we can 3-bet in this spot, and the reason being we would hope to fold out the under the gun and isolate the player in the hijack with a hand that's possibly ahead of his range. However, given the fact under the gun has open raised, we can flat the hand. The flop is bad for us, 10-10-6. Our plan is to check fold. Table 2, under the gun, open raises again. Same situation applies. We shouldn't be 3-betting our pocket queens here. In this case, it is possible under the gun is a fish, but we don't know for certain. He also may be opening a very tight range under the gun, since his PFR is 5% so far. By 3-betting queens in this spot, we are a lot of the time either effectively throwing it in the muck, or we are coolering ourselves against a hand like Kings Plus. The flop comes bad for us. The open raiser doesn't c-bet on the King 6-9 monotone. Our plan, however, is to check fold. It's unlikely we will get a flop bet through 3 players. On the turn, when the big blind leads small, it's true we are getting a good price to make the call. However, I don't think our equity is really good enough in this particular spot, especially when under the gun player tags along. Our equity against their combined ranges is just not enough to make the call. And even when the river comes a queen, it's still possible we don't have the best hand. Any 10 makes a straight. It's possible either of these players flopped a flush and is playing in some strange way. Table 3, we make a steal attempt with the ace-7 offsuit. Table 4, we pick up the 4-3 suited. We open raise the pocket 9s on table 3. On table 4, the cutoff open raises. We can definitely consider a call here with our suited connector in position. We should have reasonable implied odds against the cutoff's open raising range. The reason being, he has been playing 13-11 over 203 hands. His attempt to steal is reasonably low. We can consider making the call. It's also fine just to fold. I think that's more or less it for this session. I think we have one more hand coming up with the pocket kings, which we will see in a minute. I hope you've enjoyed the second video in the Beating the Micros series. Please leave any comments or feedback in the thread. And remember, you can ask any questions you like in the thread, and I will try my best to answer them, or to include them in some of the videos and some of the articles. We'll just look at these two hands. On table 1, we have the ace-king offsuit. Player in the hijack, open limps. We make an isolation raise to 4x with that ace-king. The flop isn't great, 8-7-3. It's possible we have the best hand, but I don't think we have much fold equity. Therefore, my plan is to try and get my ace-king high to showdown, if possible, or to improve on the turn and river. The turn comes an 8. And he bets half pot. Our plan is just to fold. Table 4, we open raise the pocket kings from the cutoff. We get 4-bet by the player in the big blind, and we have two options. We can either 4-bet with the intention of calling a shove, or we can flat and slow play our pocket kings. In this particular case, we decide to flat. The reason being, it is possible the player in the big blind is 3-betting light. The table is 5-handed at the moment, and people do 3-bet lighter the less people are at the table. I've seen 5 hands so far of the big blind player, and he has 3-bet once already. Given the fact that I suspect he might be light, I decide to flat, and hope he continues with some of his bluff hands on the flop. We can get some value when he fires a c-bet with his missed hands. We make the call. The flop is King Queen 8. It's a good flop in that we flop top set, but it's bad in that any single heart he can have has some reasonable equity against us. This is not a situation where you want to see a cheap turn card and evaluate on the turn, because this is a 3-bet pot. Your primary goal should be to get all the money in as fast as possible. In this particular case, on such a drawy board, I do think there are some hands he can stack off directly with on the flop. He himself could have a hand like pocket queens or pocket eights. He may have some strong draw. He may have ace of hearts. He may have ace king. He may have some types of combo draws, such as 10 jack with a heart. I definitely think there are plenty of hands in his range that he may consider calling a shove with on the flop. We could choose to flat. The downside to flatting is that if the turn rolls off a heart, we could be in a tough spot. The advantage to flatting is he may continue with some of his bluffs and semi-bluffs on the turn. I decide to try and get the money in as fast as possible, and I shove over his flop c-bet. And he folds. So thanks very much for watching. This has been Weasel, making the second strategy video in Beating the Micros series. I'll see you guys soon.